Ibn Khaldun, born in 1332 in Tunis, a man who lived through plagues, political betrayals, and the slow decay of empires. He wasn't theorizing from comfort, he was writing from wreckage. And the book, the Muqaddimah, often translated as the introduction, but calling it an introduction is like calling the ocean a puddle. It's a 1,400-page dissection of human civilization, its patterns, its failures, its self-inflicted wounds. Ibn Khaldun didn't write it to flatter any king or please any court. He wrote it because he'd watched powerful societies destroy themselves over and over, and he wanted to understand why. He argues that history isn't random. It isn't just a list of kings and battles. It's a science, a system with laws as predictable as gravity. Societies rise for specific reasons. They fall for specific reasons. And those reasons repeat century after century because human nature doesn't change. That's what makes the Muqaddimah dangerous. Not dangerous in the way a weapon is, dangerous in the way a mirror is. It forces you to look at the patterns you'd rather ignore. Historians call him the father of sociology. Economists claim him as one of their own. Political theorists study his work like a blueprint. But Ibn Khaldun wasn't trying to start a discipline. He was trying to deliver a diagnosis. And the diagnosis isn't comfortable. Ibn Khaldun doesn't sugarcoat it. Civilizations aren't permanent. They're not meant to be. They rise, they peak, and then, slowly, sometimes violently, they collapse. He lays it out like a diagnosis. Every civilization follows the same arc. A group of people, bound together by hardship, build something from nothing. They're hungry, disciplined, willing to bleed for each other. And that raw energy, that collective fire, is what creates empires. But here's where it turns. Success changes people. Ibn Khaldun argues that the very prosperity a civilization fights for becomes the thing that destroys it. The founders sacrifice. Their children maintain. Their grandchildren consume. And their great-grandchildren? They inherit a world they didn't build and can't sustain. He calls it a cycle, not a theory, a cycle, because he watched it happen over and over, across dynasties, across centuries, across the entire Islamic world and beyond. No civilization escapes it. None. And the timeline? Ibn Khaldun pins it at roughly 3 to 4 generations. That's it. That's all you get. From desert tents to marble palaces to rubble. He doesn't frame this as tragedy. He frames it as nature. The same way a body ages, a civilization ages. It's not a failure, it's a pattern. What makes this so unsettling is how calm he is about it. He doesn't rage against the decline, he simply maps it, like a physician who's seen the disease too many times to be surprised by the outcome. So when people talk about civilizations lasting forever, about legacies that can't be touched, Ibn Khaldun would have had one response. You're not the exception. You never were. The clock started the moment you began to build. Ibn Khaldun doesn't start with kings. He doesn't start with armies or gold or treaties. He starts with something far more dangerous, something you can't see, can't measure, can't put on a map. He calls it Asabiyyah, group feeling, social cohesion, the invisible thread that binds a people together so tightly they'd bleed for each other without being asked. It's not loyalty, it's deeper than that. It's the kind of bond forged in hardship, in deserts, in mountains, in places where survival isn't guaranteed, and you either hold together or you die alone. Ibn Khaldun argues that Asabiyyah is the single most important force in human civilization. Not wealth, not military power, not even faith. Those things matter, but without Asabiyyah, they collapse under their own weight. He's blunt about it. A group with strong Asabiyyah can conquer a group without it, every time. Doesn't matter how rich the other side is, how many soldiers they have, how grand their cities look. If the bonds are weak, the structure falls. And here's what makes his analysis so unsettling. He doesn't treat Asabiyyah as permanent. It's not something a civilization earns and keeps forever. It fades, slowly, generationally. The very success it creates becomes the thing that destroys it. Comfort replaces struggle. Luxury replaces sacrifice, and the thread snaps. He warns that no empire, no dynasty, no ruling class is immune to this decay. The moment a group stops needing each other, truly needing each other, the decline has already begun. They just don't know it yet. So before the palaces and the politics and the power struggles, Ibn Khaldun points to something quieter, something almost primal. The question isn't who has the biggest army, it's who would die for the person standing next to them. Ibn Khaldun doesn't sugarcoat it. Civilizations don't just decline, they rot, and he maps that rot across exactly 4 generations. The first generation, the founders. Ibn Khaldun describes them as hardened, hungry, bound together by struggle. They build because they have to. Survival isn't a concept to them, it's breakfast. They share everything. They fight for each other. And that collective fire, that's what builds empires. The second generation inherits the machinery, but still remembers the cost. They watched their fathers bleed, so they maintain, they protect. But something subtle shifts. The hunger dims, just slightly. Ibn Khaldun notes that this generation lives in the shadow of greatness rather than in the act of creating it. Then comes the third generation, and this is where things start to crack. Ibn Khaldun argues that by now, the memory of hardship has faded into story, into myth. They enjoy the wealth but feel entitled to it. They imitate tradition without understanding why it existed in the first place. The rituals remain. The substance doesn't. The fourth generation? Ibn Khaldun calls it the death blow. They inherit everything and respect nothing. He warns that this generation believes greatness is a birthright, not something earned through sacrifice and solidarity. They are soft, disconnected, and completely unaware that the ground beneath them is already hollow. What's devastating about this framework isn't the collapse itself, it's the invisibility of it. Each generation thinks it's doing fine. Each one believes the empire is solid. But Ibn Khaldun sees what they can't, that comfort is a slow poison, that every luxury purchased with the currency of forgotten struggle brings the end one step closer. 4 generations, that's all he gives a civilization. Build, maintain, decay, collapse. Ibn Khaldun watches empires crumble, and he notices something. It's never the enemy at the gates that kills a civilization first. It's the softness within. He argues that luxury is a slow poison, not overnight, not dramatic. It seeps in quietly, generation by generation, until the people who built something extraordinary can no longer recognize themselves. Here's how he breaks it down. The first generation fights, they bleed, they sacrifice. They build a civilization out of nothing because they have no choice. Survival sharpens them. Hardship is their teacher. And because of that, they're disciplined, hungry, unified. But then comes wealth, comfort. The second generation inherits what they didn't build. They still remember the struggle, maybe through their parents' stories, maybe through some lingering toughness. But the edge is already dulling. They start to enjoy the rewards. And why wouldn't they? They earned nothing, but they have everything. By the third generation, it's over. Ibn Khaldun doesn't sugarcoat it. He says they grow up believing the world owes them comfort. They've never known hunger, never known fear. The discipline that built their empire becomes an inconvenience. They want ease, entertainment, status without substance. And the empire, it hollows out from the inside. He warns that this isn't a moral failure of individuals, it's a structural inevitability. Luxury doesn't just weaken people, it rewires what they value. Hard work stops being admired, sacrifice becomes something only fools do. The culture shifts from production to consumption, from building to spending. Ibn Khaldun saw this pattern everywhere he looked. The Umayyads, the Abbasids, every dynasty that rose in fire and collapsed in silk. The uncomfortable truth he presents is simple. Comfort doesn't reward civilization, it dismantles it. Slowly, quietly, while everyone's too busy enjoying themselves to notice the foundation cracking beneath their feet. Ibn Khaldun wasn't just a thinker locked away in some tower. He was in the room, advising sultans, negotiating with conquerors, watching towers shift hands, sometimes peacefully, mostly not. And every ruler wanted him close, not because they loved philosophy, because Ibn Khaldun understood something dangerous. He understood how power actually works, how it's gained, how it's kept, and more importantly, how it slips away. He served under multiple dynasties across North Africa and Al-Andalus, switched courts, switched allegiances, not out of disloyalty, out of survival. The political world he moved through was ruthless. Rulers didn't retire. They were overthrown, exiled, killed. And the scholars who served them, they either adapted or disappeared. Ibn Khaldun adapted, but he was never fully trusted. That's the thing about someone who can see through the mechanics of power. The people holding power don't always want that kind of clarity around. He was useful, brilliant even, but also threatening. A man who could explain why your dynasty would fall isn't exactly the kind of company kings keep for comfort. He even sat face to face with Timur, one of the most feared conquerors in history, outside the walls of Damascus, not as a warrior, as a mind. Timur wanted to understand the lands he was about to take, and Ibn Khaldun, he gave him that understanding, calmly, precisely, while a city burned behind them. That moment says everything. Ibn Khaldun wasn't loyal to any empire. He was loyal to the pattern, to the observation. He watched thrones rise and crumble, and instead of mourning, he took notes. Every empire tried to use him, but none of them owned him. And maybe that's why his work survived long after every court he served in turned to dust. The empires are gone. The analysis remains. Most people think empires fall because of bad leaders, or foreign invasions, or some catastrophic event no one saw coming. Ibn Khaldun disagrees. He argues that every dynasty carries the seeds of its own destruction from the very beginning, not because of outside threats, because of something built into the cycle itself, something unavoidable. He maps it out with almost clinical precision. A dynasty rises through raw Asabiyyah, that fierce group solidarity born from hardship. The founders are tough, hungry. They know what it means to suffer, and that suffering binds them. They take power not because they're sophisticated, but because they're unified in a way their enemies aren't. But then something shifts. The second generation inherits the throne, not the struggle. They hear stories of the desert, but sleep in palaces. They know power, but they didn't earn it. And by the third generation, the connection to that original fire is gone entirely. They grow up surrounded by luxury, servants, ceremony. They assume the empire will sustain itself. It won't. Ibn Khaldun gives it roughly 4 generations, sometimes 5, rarely more. That's the lifespan of a dynasty, not centuries of gradual erosion, a sharp, predictable arc from hunger to comfort to collapse. And he's ruthless about why. He argues that luxury isn't just a reward for success, it's a poison. It softens the ruling class, makes them dependent on mercenaries instead of their own people, makes them paranoid instead of bold. They start spending more on protecting what they have than on building anything new. He warns that this isn't a flaw in certain dynasties, it's a law, a pattern woven into the nature of power itself. No ruling family escapes it. No amount of wealth or military strength delays it for long. The founders conquer, the inheritors maintain, and the final generation, they watch it all slip through their fingers. Here's a truth most intellectuals don't want to hear. Ibn Khaldun argues that in the contest between the pen and the sword wins, every single time. Not because soldiers are smarter, not because they're more virtuous, but because power at its core is physical before it is intellectual. Ibn Khaldun observes that scholars, philosophers, jurists, theologians, they refine civilizations, they don't build them, and they certainly don't defend them. He points out something uncomfortable. Scholars thrive in stability. They need courts, patronage, libraries, peace. But the men who create that stability, they don't read philosophy. They ride horses, they command loyalty through blood and shared danger. Ibn Khaldun is blunt about this. The people who think deeply about power are almost never the ones who hold it. And it gets worse. Ibn Khaldun warns that intellectuals, by their very nature, are isolated. They work alone. They argue with each other over abstractions. They lack what he considers the essential ingredient of political dominance, Asabiyyah, that group cohesion, that tribal bond forged through collective struggle. Scholars don't have it. Soldiers do. So what happens? Empires are won by warriors. Then scholars move in. They build the institutions, write the laws, educate the elite. And for a while, it works. But Ibn Khaldun sees the trap. The more a civilization relies on its intellectuals, the softer it becomes. The bureaucrats replace the generals. The debate halls replace the battlefields. And when the next hungry group arrives at the gates, rough, unified, desperate, the scholars have no answer. He isn't celebrating this. Ibn Khaldun doesn't think soldiers are better than scholars. He thinks reality is indifferent to what we wish were true. Knowledge doesn't protect a civilization. Cohesion does. Willingness to fight does. And scholars? They're always the last to realize the walls are already falling. Ibn Khaldun draws a line. On one side, the desert. On the other, the palace. And everything about how civilizations live and die sits between those 2 points. He calls it the divide between Bedouin life and urban life, not as a romantic preference for one over the other, but as a diagnosis. The desert, he argues, produces strong people, not because it's noble, because it's brutal. There's no room for laziness when the land gives you nothing. You hunt or you starve. You cooperate or you perish. Every member of the group matters. Every skill counts. The palace is different. The palace is where strength goes to die. Ibn Khaldun points out that urban life, settled, comfortable, structured, breeds dependency. People stop relying on themselves and start relying on systems, on servants, on institutions, on someone else's labor. The individual weakens because the environment no longer demands anything from them. And it's not just physical. He argues the decay is moral too. In the desert, your word matters. Trust is survival. But in the city, relationships become transactional. Loyalty becomes performance. People learn to manipulate instead of cooperate. He's not saying everyone should go live in tents. That's not the point. The point is what each environment does to the human character over time. The desert strips you down to what's essential. The palace buries you under what's unnecessary. And here's where it gets sharp. Ibn Khaldun argues that the very people who conquer cities, the tough, desert-hardened tribes, eventually become the soft urbanites they once overthrew. They move into the palaces, they adopt the luxuries, and within a few generations, they're indistinguishable from the people they replaced. The cycle doesn't break, it just resets. He warns that geography isn't destiny, but environment shapes character, and character determines whether a civilization stands or falls. Ibn Khaldun watches it happen again and again. A civilization grows wealthy, comfortable, and somewhere along the way, its people stop wanting to fight their own wars, so they hire someone else to do it. Mercenaries, foreign soldiers, slave armies. It doesn't matter what you call them. The result is the same. The moment a civilization hands its defense to outsiders, it signs its own death warrant. Ibn Khaldun is blunt about this. A society that can't or won't protect itself has already begun to die. And he doesn't blame the mercenaries. He blames the decay, the softening, the generations raised on luxury who see warfare as beneath them, who'd rather pay someone to bleed than bleed themselves. That shift, from sacrifice to transaction, is where the rot begins. He points to dynasty after dynasty that made this exact mistake. The Abbasids, the later Umayyads, kingdoms across North Africa. They built vast armies of outsiders who had no loyalty to the land, no stake in its survival. These soldiers fought for gold, not for belonging, and when the gold ran out, or a better offer came, they turned. Ibn Khaldun argues that military strength isn't just about numbers or weapons, it's about cohesion, about people who fight because they share something deeper than a paycheck. When that bond disappears, no amount of hired steel can replace it. And here's what cuts deepest. The outsourcing doesn't happen because a civilization is weak. It happens because it's rich. Wealth creates distance between a people and the violence required to maintain what they have. They forget that everything they enjoy was built on someone's willingness to die for it. So the empire hires strangers to guard its walls, and Ibn Khaldun asks the question no one wants to hear. Who guards you from the guards? Ibn Khaldun isn't interested in theology. He's not asking whether God exists or which faith is true. That's not his game. He's asking something far more provocative. What does religion do to power? And his answer is uncomfortable. He argues that religion is one of the most effective political tools in human history. Not because it's false, he's not making that claim, but because of what it does to groups. It takes Asabiyyah, that raw tribal cohesion, and supercharges it, gives it a cause beyond blood, beyond territory, beyond survival. A tribe fights for itself, but a tribe with a shared religious mission, it fights for something eternal, and that changes everything. He points out that the great empires of the Islamic world didn't rise on swords alone. They rose because faith unified people who otherwise had no reason to stand together. Different clans, different bloodlines, different grievances. Religion dissolved those barriers. It created a new kind of solidarity, one that could scale far beyond the limits of kinship. But Ibn Khaldun doesn't romanticize this. He's too sharp for that. He also warns that religion in the hands of a declining dynasty becomes hollow, ritual without conviction, a ruling class performing piety while rotting from the inside. The prayers continue, the mosques stay full, but the fire behind them is gone. And once that happens, religion stops being the engine, it becomes the mask, a way to justify authority that no longer deserves justification. He argues that the relationship between faith and power is never static. In the early stages of a dynasty, religion is genuine fuel. It drives expansion, discipline, sacrifice. But in the later stages, it becomes decoration, a coat of paint on a crumbling wall. Ibn Khaldun sees this pattern repeating across centuries. Faith builds empires, and then empires hollow out the faith that built them. Ibn Khaldun doesn't start with kings or armies. He starts with dirt, with climate, with the land itself. Because before politics, before religion, before philosophy, there is geography. And geography, he argues, dictates everything. He divides the world into climatic zones, and he's ruthless about it. The extreme north and the extreme south, Ibn Khaldun considers them barely civilized, too harsh, too demanding. The people there spend all their energy just surviving. There's nothing left for art, for science, for building anything beyond shelter. The temperate middle zones, that's where civilizations flourish, not by accident, by design. The land permits it. But Ibn Khaldun goes deeper than just climate. He argues that terrain shapes character. Desert people are tougher, leaner, more cohesive. They have to be. The land gives them nothing for free. Mountain communities develop fierce independence. And the fertile plains, they breed comfort, abundance, and eventually, weakness. This isn't romanticism. Ibn Khaldun isn't glorifying the desert nomad for poetic reasons. He's making a structural argument. The environment produces the psychology produces the social order, and the social order determines whether a civilization rises or rots. He warns that people forget this. Settled urban populations start to believe their sophistication is self-generated, that their wealth comes from their intelligence alone. But Ibn Khaldun traces it back, always back, to the geography that made surplus possible in the first place. Remove the favorable conditions, and the whole structure crumbles. And here's the burial. The very land that nurtures a civilization also traps it. Fertile regions attract invaders. Wealthy cities become targets. The geography that built the empire becomes the reason someone else wants to take it. So the land giveth, and the land taketh away. Ibn Khaldun understood that civilizations don't just live on the earth, they are subject to it. Ibn Khaldun doesn't dance around it. He says it plainly. When justice disappears from a civilization, everything else follows. Not eventually, not slowly, fast. He argues that injustice isn't just a moral failing. It's an economic catastrophe, a structural collapse disguised as policy. When rulers begin extracting wealth from their people, through excessive taxation, through seizure, through rigged markets, they don't just hurt individuals, they destroy the incentive to produce. And once that incentive dies, the economy doesn't stumble, it caves in. He's not talking about petty theft here. He's talking about state-level corruption, the kind that wears a crown, the kind that writes its own laws. Ibn Khaldun warns that the most dangerous oppressor isn't the bandit on the road. It's the ruler in the palace who believes his power entitles him to the wealth of his subjects. And here's what makes his analysis cut so deep. He doesn't blame corruption on evil alone. He blames it on comfort, on luxury, on the slow drift of a dynasty from hunger to excess. The founders fought for what they built. Their heirs just spend it. And to fund that spending, they squeeze the people beneath them. Ibn Khaldun points out something brutal. Once corruption takes root, it becomes self-reinforcing. Officials mimic the ruler. Merchants bribe to survive. Citizens withdraw from public life. Trust collapses. And without trust, there is no commerce, no cooperation, no civilization. He calls injustice the destroyer of civilization. Not war, not famine, injustice. Because war can be survived. Famine can pass. But a society that cannibalizes its own people from the inside, that has no recovery, not without a complete reset. This isn't ancient theory. This is a pattern Ibn Khaldun traced across empires, and one he believed was inescapable once it began. The rot, once in, doesn't reverse. It spreads. You've probably heard the phrase, hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. It sounds like something from a modern Twitter thread, but Ibn Khaldun laid this out over 600 years ago, and he didn't frame it as a catchy slogan. He built an entire theory of civilization around it. Ibn Khaldun argues that societies move in cycles, not random ones, predictable ones. A group rises from hardship. They're hungry, disciplined, bound together by something deeper than ambition. They build, they conquer, they establish order. And then, slowly, quietly, they begin to rot from the inside. He calls this binding force Asabiyyah, group solidarity. It's the glue, the thing that makes a tribe willing to bleed for each other. And it's strongest when life is hardest. When survival isn't guaranteed, people hold tight. They have to. But here's where it turns. Ibn Khaldun warns that success is the very thing that destroys what built it. Once a civilization reaches comfort, once wealth flows and power feels permanent, the hunger dies, the discipline fades, the solidarity that held everything together starts to crack. He doesn't romanticize the fall. He treats it as inevitable, a law of human societies, not an opinion. Every dynasty, every empire, every ruling class, they carry the seeds of their own collapse the moment they stop struggling. And what replaces them? Another hungry group. Another generation forged in difficulty. The cycle resets. Ibn Khaldun isn't offering hope here. He's offering a diagnosis, a clinical, unflinching look at why civilizations don't last. Not because of bad luck, not because of external enemies, but because prosperity itself is the disease. That's the core of everything he writes, and it never stops being uncomfortable. Ibn Khaldun doesn't treat plagues as random acts of nature. He treats them as turning points, moments where entire civilizations get forced into a hard restart, whether they're ready or not. He witnessed this firsthand. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed systems. Trade networks collapsed, tax revenues dried up, skilled labor vanished overnight. And the societies that survived, they weren't the same societies anymore. They couldn't be. Ibn Khaldun argues that pandemics don't create decline, they expose it. A civilization already rotting from within, bloated bureaucracies, fractured social bonds, rulers disconnected from reality, that civilization doesn't survive a plague intact. It can't. The disease just accelerates what was already happening. And here's what makes his analysis so unsettling. He doesn't frame recovery as some triumphant comeback story. He frames it as replacement. The old order doesn't heal, it gets swept aside. New groups move in, new power structures form. New Asabiyyah, that raw collective solidarity, rises from the wreckage, but it belongs to different people now. He points out something most historians gloss over. The demographic collapse after a pandemic doesn't just reduce numbers, it reshapes who holds power, who controls resources, who gets to rebuild. The survivors inherit a different world, and they build according to their own logic, not the logic of what came before. So pandemics, in his framework, aren't interruptions, they're corrections, brutal, indiscriminate corrections that strip away the illusion of permanence. Ibn Khaldun warns that no civilization, no matter how vast or sophisticated, is immune to this. The very complexity that makes an empire powerful also makes it fragile. One shock, one sustained, systemic shock, and the whole thing buckles. Not because the plague was strong, but because the foundation was already cracked. That's the part no one wants to hear. Ibn Khaldun saw something that most rulers refuse to see, that the very tool they used to build power, taxation, was the same tool that destroyed it. He argues that in the early stages of a dynasty, taxes are low. The state doesn't need much. It's lean, hungry. And because the burden is light, people produce more. They trade, they build, they invest. The economy grows, and ironically, the state collects more revenue, not despite the low rates, but because of them. But then something shifts. The dynasty ages. The ruling class develops expensive tastes, palaces, armies, luxuries they now consider necessities. And to fund all of it, they do the one thing that feels logical. They raise taxes. Ibn Khaldun warns that this is where the rot begins. Higher taxes don't mean higher revenue. Not for long, because people stop trying. Why work harder when the state takes most of what you earn? Merchants pull back. Farmers produce less. The entire economic engine starts to stall. And the state, desperate for funds, raises taxes again. A vicious cycle. A slow suffocation. He points out that rulers never see themselves as the problem. They blame the people for being lazy. They blame the merchants for hiding wealth. But the real disease is at the top. Greed dressed up as governance. And here's what makes Ibn Khaldun's analysis so striking. He wrote this 600 years before Arthur Laffer drew his famous curve on a napkin. The idea that there's an optimal tax rate and that exceeding it actually reduces revenue. Ibn Khaldun didn't just theorize it, he observed it. Dynasty after dynasty, empire after empire. The same pattern, the same collapse. Taxation, in his framework, isn't just an economic policy, it's a mirror. It reflects exactly where a civilization stands on the arc of its own decline. Ibn Khaldun never saw the fall of the Ottomans. He died centuries before it happened, but he described it almost perfectly before it even began. That's the terrifying part. He laid out a pattern, a cycle, and then history repeated it so precisely that it feels less like scholarship and more like prophecy. But Ibn Khaldun wasn't a prophet. He was a diagnostician. He studied civilizations the way a doctor studies disease, and he kept finding the same symptoms. Take Rome, a republic forged in discipline and shared sacrifice, Asabiyyah at its peak. But as the empire expanded, so did the distance between its people and its purpose. Wealth poured in, loyalty poured out. The legions that once fought for Rome began fighting for whoever paid them. Ibn Khaldun would have recognized that collapse instantly. He described it centuries before any European historian bothered to ask why Rome fell. Persia, same story, different geography. The Sassanids built an empire on cohesion and military strength. But over time, the court grew bloated. The provinces grew resentful. The rulers surrounded themselves of luxury and lost touch with the people who actually held the empire together. Ibn Khaldun argues this isn't coincidence, it's structure. It's what power does to those who hold it too long. And then the Ottomans. Early Ottoman rulers were warriors. They led from the front. They earned loyalty through presence, through action. But by the later centuries, sultans ruled from behind palace walls. Janissaries, once the backbone of the military, became a political class of their own. The empire didn't collapse from outside pressure alone, it hollowed out from within. Ibn Khaldun didn't need to name these empires specifically, he named the process: the rise through solidarity, the peak through conquest, the decay through comfort, the fall through disconnection. Every empire thinks it's the exception. None of them are. Ibn Khaldun never used the word nationalism. It didn't exist in his vocabulary. But the thing he described, that deep, almost irrational loyalty to your group, that's exactly what modern nationalism feeds on. He called it Asabiyyah, and he understood it better than most political theorists who came centuries after him. Ibn Khaldun argues that Asabiyyah isn't just tribal pride, it's the survival instinct of a collective. The feeling that your people are your people, and you'll fight for them before you fight for anyone else. It doesn't need to be logical. It doesn't need to be fair. It just needs to be felt. Now, look at the modern world. Nations rally around flags, anthems, shared myths of origin. Politicians invoke the glory of the past to stir something in the present, and it works, every time. Because what they're really activating is Asabiyyah, dressed up in newer clothes. But Ibn Khaldun would have seen the danger in this too. He points out that Asabiyyah is powerful precisely because it's emotional, not rational. It can unify a people. It can also blind them. When group loyalty becomes absolute, it stops asking questions. It stops tolerating dissent. And that's when solidarity turns into something darker. He warns that the same force that builds empires can also make them brittle. A nation so consumed with its own identity that it can't adapt, can't absorb new ideas, can't tolerate difference. That nation is already on the decline. It just doesn't know it yet. And here's what's striking. Ibn Khaldun saw this pattern in 14th century North Africa, in the rise and fall of Berber dynasties and Arab kingdoms. But the logic hasn't aged a day. Swap the tribes for nation-states. Swap the deserts for parliaments. The mechanics are identical. Asabiyyah builds, Asabiyyah blinds, and eventually, Asabiyyah breaks. Ibn Khaldun saw a pattern. Every civilization, once it stabilizes, starts building institutions, rules, hierarchies, layers of administration. And at first, this works. It has to. You can't govern a sprawling empire on handshake deals and tribal loyalty alone. But then something shifts. The bureaucracy stops serving the civilization. The civilization starts serving the bureaucracy. Procedures become more important than outcomes. Titles matter more than talent. And the people running the system, they're no longer builders. They're maintainers, gatekeepers. Their job isn't to create, it's to protect what already exists. Ibn Khaldun argues that this is where innovation goes to die. Not with a dramatic collapse, not with some obvious failure. It dies quietly, in committees, in approval chains, in the slow, suffocating weight of institutional inertia. He points out that early-stage civilizations are ruthlessly creative. They have to be. Survival demands it. There's no cushion, no safety net, no manual. So people improvise, they adapt, they take risks because standing still means extinction. But comfort changes everything. Once a society reaches a certain level of wealth and security, risk becomes the enemy. Why experiment when the current system works? Why challenge the structure when you benefit from it? The very success that built the empire becomes the reason no one dares to question it. And that's the trap. Ibn Khaldun warns that bureaucracies don't just slow things down, they actively punish deviation. New ideas threaten existing power. Fresh thinking disrupts established hierarchies. So the system resists, not out of malice, out of self-preservation. He sees this as inevitable, not a flaw in one particular empire or dynasty, a flaw in the nature of organized power itself. The machine gets built to solve problems, then it becomes the problem, and by the time anyone notices, the decay is already structural. Ibn Khaldun doesn't romanticize collapse, he maps it. And one of the most brutal stages in his framework is this: the moment a dying civilization attracts its replacement. He argues that when a dynasty weakens, it sends out a signal, not intentionally, but decay has a scent. And those on the margins, the hungry, the hardened, the ones still bound by group solidarity, they pick up on it. He calls this solidarity Asabiyyah, and the people who have it in abundance are always watching those who've lost it. These aren't mindless invaders. Ibn Khaldun is careful about that. He doesn't paint them as savages. They're simply groups with stronger cohesion, tighter bonds, and a willingness to endure what the comfortable no longer can. They come from the desert, from the mountains, from the edges of empire. And they don't arrive because they're evil. They arrive because the center is hollow. He points out that the old dynasty, by this stage, can barely defend itself. Its soldiers are mercenaries with no loyalty. Its leaders are more concerned with palace politics than border threats. The taxes have strangled the economy. The people feel no allegiance to a state that only takes from them. So when the new force arrives, resistance is almost symbolic. And Ibn Khaldun sees this not as tragedy, but as inevitability, a law of history as reliable as gravity. Strong groups build, comfort softens, softness invites conquest, the conquered become the conquerors, and then the cycle starts again. What makes his analysis so uncomfortable is that he removes morality from the equation entirely. There are no villains here, no heroes, just patterns. The barbarians at the gate aren't a punishment, they're a consequence, a natural response to a vacuum that somebody, anybody, was always going to fill. Ibn Khaldun didn't just study history, he invented a way to study it. He called it al-Umran, the science of civilization. And when he introduced it, nobody cared. Not really. The scholars of his time were busy with theology, with jurisprudence, with poetry. Nobody was asking why empires rise and fall. Nobody was looking for patterns beneath the surface of events. He was. Ibn Khaldun argues that history, as it was practiced in his day, was broken. Chroniclers recorded what happened, who conquered whom, who built what, but they never asked why. They never questioned the mechanics underneath. And without that question, history was just a collection of stories. Entertaining, maybe. Useful, barely. So he built something new, a framework, a method for examining human society the way a scientist examines the natural world, not through speculation, through observation, through comparison, through identifying forces that repeat across time and geography. And he didn't limit it to politics. al-Umran covered everything: economics, culture, population, labor, climate, religion, social bonds. Ibn Khaldun saw civilization as a living system, every part connected. every shift in one area sending ripples through the rest. Pull one thread and the whole fabric moves. But here's the tragedy. His contemporaries didn't grasp what he'd done. The Muqaddimah, his masterwork, was read, copied, even admired, but the science inside it, ignored, for centuries. It wasn't until European thinkers stumbled onto similar ideas, sociology, economics, political theory, that anyone realized Ibn Khaldun had been there first, centuries first. He essentially founded sociology before the word existed, built a theory of economics before Adam Smith was born, mapped the psychology of power before Machiavelli picked up a pen, and the world shrugged. Ibn Khaldun didn't just write ahead of his time, he wrote so far ahead that his time couldn't even recognize what it was looking at. Most people think decline is something you can reverse, that if you just elect the right leader, pass the right policy, return to the right values, things can be saved. Ibn Khaldun disagrees. He argues that there is a point in every civilization's life where the decay becomes structural. Not a bad season, not a rough decade, a terminal condition. And by the time most people notice it, that point has already passed. It starts with luxury, not wealth itself. Ibn Khaldun isn't against prosperity, but he watches what prosperity does to the people who inherit it rather than earn it. The third and fourth generations, he says, are the most dangerous. They grow up in comfort. They've never built anything. They assume the world they were born into is the world that will always exist, and so they stop doing the things that created it. Ibn Khaldun points out that the ruling class begins to outsource its own survival. Mercenaries replace citizen soldiers. Bureaucrats replace leaders who actually govern. Taxes rise, not to build, but to maintain the illusion. The state becomes a shell, impressive on the outside, hollow within. He warns that this hollowing is almost invisible at first. The institutions still stand, the titles still exist, the ceremonies continue, but the substance, the will, the cohesion, the shared sacrifice is gone. And once it's gone, no reform can bring it back. Not really. That's the brutal part. Ibn Khaldun doesn't offer a rescue plan. He doesn't say, here's how you stop it. He says, this is what happens, every time. The cycle doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't reward awareness. Even a society that reads Ibn Khaldun and recognizes itself in his words, even that society can't escape the pattern. Knowing the disease doesn't make you immune to it. Ibn Khaldun doesn't just say empires rise and fall. He maps it. 5 stages, each one predictable, each one feeding into the next like clockwork. The first stage is conquest. A hungry, unified group, bound by Asabiyyah, overthrows the existing order. They're lean, disciplined. They share the burden and the reward equally. No luxury, no excess, just raw collective will. The second stage is consolidation. The new ruler centralizes power. Authority shifts from the group to the individual. Loyalty narrows. The leader no longer rules with his people. He rules over them. And the very solidarity that won the empire starts to erode. The third stage is prosperity. This is where things look golden from the outside. Wealth flows, architecture rises, culture flourishes. But Ibn Khaldun warns, this is also where the rot begins. Comfort replaces hunger. Dependence replaces self-reliance. The ruling class stops earning its position and starts inheriting it. The fourth stage is complacency. The rulers now live off the achievements of their predecessors. They spend freely. They imitate greatness without understanding what produced it. Ibn Khaldun argues that this is the most dangerous phase because it feels stable. Everything still functions, the institutions hold, but beneath the surface, the foundation is hollowing out. The fifth stage is collapse. Resources dry up, loyalty fractures. The ruler, desperate to maintain control, squeezes harder. Higher taxes, more coercion, more spectacle. But it's too late. A new group, hungrier and more unified, is already gathering at the edges, and the cycle begins again. He doesn't present this as a theory of one dynasty. He presents it as the grammar of power itself. Every empire, every ruling class, every generation that mistakes inherited wealth for earned strength, the pattern doesn't change, only the names do. And that's what makes it so relentless. Ibn Khaldun doesn't treat economics as a separate discipline. For him, it's the bloodstream of civilization, and when that blood flow gets choked, the body dies, every time. He argues that a dynasty's economic health follows a painfully predictable arc. Early on, the rulers are modest. They take only what they need. People keep most of what they earn. And that freedom, that breathing room, is what fuels growth. Markets thrive, trade routes expand, wealth multiplies, not because of the state, but because the state stays out of the way. Then comes the turn. The ruling elite grows, the court expands. Advisors, bureaucrats, relatives, everyone needs a salary, everyone needs a title, and all of it costs money. So the state reaches deeper into the pockets of its people. Ibn Khaldun warns that this isn't just bad policy, it's a death sentence. Because once the productive class feels squeezed, they don't rebel, they just stop. They shrink their businesses, they hide their earnings, they leave. And the state, now bleeding revenue, doesn't pause to reflect. It doubles down. More taxes, more regulations, more control, each measure designed to extract what's no longer there. He points out something that modern economists still struggle to accept, that a government can tax itself into poverty, that the very act of grasping for more guarantees you'll end up with less. It's not a paradox, it's arithmetic. You can't harvest from a field you've already burned. Ibn Khaldun saw this play out across North Africa, the Middle East, dynasty after dynasty. The details changed, the languages changed, but the pattern never did. A state that begins by serving its people ends by feeding on them. And by the time the rulers realize what they've done, there's nothing left to save. The economy isn't broken, it's been eaten alive. Most thinkers before Ibn Khaldun explain the rise and fall of kingdoms through one lens: God's will, a king's virtue, military strength. Pick one, build your theory, move on. Ibn Khaldun rejected that approach entirely. He introduces the concept of Umran, often translated as civilization or social organization, but that translation doesn't quite capture it. Umran is everything: the economy, the culture, the demographics, the moral fabric, the relationship between ruler and ruled. It's the entire living organism of a society, operating as one interconnected system. And Ibn Khaldun argues that you cannot understand any single part without understanding the whole. A military defeat isn't just a military problem, it's a symptom of weakened solidarity, declining revenue, overstretched bureaucracy, and a ruling elite that's lost its grip. A famine isn't just bad weather, it's tied to taxation, to trade routes, to how far removed a government has become from the people it's supposed to feed. He sees society the way a physician sees a body. Everything is connected. Touch one organ, the others respond, and disease rarely starts where the pain shows up. This is what makes Ibn Khaldun so different from his contemporaries. He doesn't write history as a list of kings and battles. He writes it as a science. He calls it the study of Umran, the underlying laws that govern why societies behave the way they do. Not what happened, but why it had to happen. And here's what's unsettling about it. Ibn Khaldun suggests that these forces operate whether people are aware of them or not.
Leaders make choices thinking they're in control. They're not. They're responding to pressures they can't fully see, currents beneath the surface, pulling everything in directions no single person decided. Umran doesn't ask for permission. It moves, and societies move with it, or get dragged.
So the question lands where it always does. If Ibn Khaldun mapped this cycle so precisely, rise, peak, decay, collapse, can we actually escape it? Or are we just passengers on a wheel that never stops turning? Ibn Khaldun himself wasn't optimistic. He didn't offer a cure. He offered a diagnosis. And his diagnosis was clear. Every civilization carries the seeds of its own destruction. The very success that builds an empire is what eventually softens it. The wealth that rewards ambition is what breeds complacency. The power that unifies a people is what corrupts their leaders. But does that mean it's inevitable? He never says escape is impossible. He says it's never happened. And there's a difference. A slim one, but a difference. Some modern thinkers have tried to answer where Ibn Khaldun left off: institutional safeguards, constitutional limits, systems designed to check power before it devours itself. And maybe, those mechanisms buy time, slow the rot, extend the timeline between rise and fall. But Ibn Khaldun would push back on that. He'd ask a harder question. Who builds those institutions? People. And people, he argues, are shaped by their generation's place in the cycle. The founders build with discipline. Their children maintain with duty. Their grandchildren inherit with entitlement. No constitution survives a generation that doesn't believe in it. So maybe the answer isn't breaking the cycle. Maybe it's recognizing where you stand inside it. That's what Ibn Khaldun actually gives us. Not a way out, a mirror. A brutally honest one. He doesn't promise salvation. He promises clarity. And clarity, uncomfortable as it is, might be the only tool that matters. Because the civilizations that fell, every single one, didn't fall because they lacked warning signs. They fell because they refused to read them. Ibn Khaldun made sure we can't say we weren't told.